You do those three things, you can be certified. The impact assessment, as I mentioned, really has 5 different areas: customers, environment, community, workers, and governance. There are about 200 questions on the impact assessment, somewhere around there. I can't give you an exact number because there are 78 different versions of the impact assessment. The assessment changes based upon 3 variables: where you're located, how big you are, and what industry you're in. Okay? That represents about 72 versions. And then from there, we add on some industry addenda. Like, I'm sure most of you are familiar with GRI. GRI has kind of pioneered the idea of adding in addenda per industry. We're following their lead. We've done the same thing. I think we probably have about 6 industries that we've done so far, and we'll continue to add industries over time. But the idea is to add through those addenda granularity and specificity. And we begin by focusing on those industries where kind of the core questions you expect on our typical impact assessment just isn't enough. The best example I have is financial services. If you don't dive a little more deeply about whom they're lending to, how they're lending, you're really not understanding the impact of that business. So we have a financial services addenda with 4 tracks, depending upon what type of financial service organization you are, that delivers that granularity and specificity. In terms of the legal requirement, let's just pause on it for a second. It's about fundamentally giving protection and permission for companies to act differently. That's at the core of what we're doing: protection and permission, so that companies can behave in a way that considers not just maximizing profits, but also how those decisions impact their stakeholders. Okay? Importantly, it's got some accountability, right? It's not enough just to give them permission and protection. There has to be some teeth to the legal change. And that teeth is through giving shareholders incremental rights. So anybody who's made this change, you actually have an increased set of obligations to your shareholders. Really importantly, it does not create a third-party right action, right? It would be an absolute disaster if we created an opportunity for anybody to sue anybody if they violated some stakeholder obligation. So as much as I admire Greenpeace, we don't want to give Greenpeace the opportunity to sue anybody because the company's not green enough. This has got to be a covenant between the company and the shareholders. And by the way, to make this change, typically requires a 2/3 supermajority vote. So shareholders have already opted in, right? They bought into the idea of a different legal framework, of different outcomes from this business, and they are given the opportunity to hold companies accountable if they do not deliver on considering the impact on all stakeholders. So that's the legal framework. In terms of where we're at, we got about, call it 2,250 certified B corporations. Somewhere around there, 54 different countries, 150 different industries. Commonality, they're all using business as a force for good. There's lots of things that I take great pride in our community and what we've all been able to collectively achieve over the last decade. It is this slide that I'm most proud of, because it is an incredibly diverse community, geographically, industry-wise, and size-wise. We have multi-billion-dollar companies down to sole proprietors. We have companies all across the globe. And importantly, we have leaders in all of the different impact areas. We have social enterprises ranging all the way over to sustainable businesses. And what they've all come together to say is we are common, most importantly, in our mission. We're doing something different than just creating private wealth with our business. We're also creating public benefit. It is that community on which we stand. Everything else that this movement does is enabled by the 2,250 certified B corporations. So how do we leverage the leadership of that community, right? At the end of the day, we're talking about, remember that little mountain slide, find a community of leaders, encourage others to follow, and inspire billions of consumers, workers, and investors. How do we encourage companies to follow the lead of the community of certified B corporations? That is the core question. Because at the end of the day, the truth is the certification is not designed to make all companies in the world certified B corporations. That's not its intent. It's supposed to be the best of the best, right? The cream of the crop, the gold star certification. And so we got to provide tools for all other companies to follow the lead of this community. And we really have two vehicles that we use to try to drive scale, to try to get more companies enabled to be like a B Corp. The first is around something we call impact governance. This is really around our legal framework, all right? We fundamentally wanted that legal framework to be available for any company to use, so that tens of thousands of companies, hundreds of thousands of companies have fundamentally changed their governance structure. And what we learned early on, admittedly, we were really ignorant about, corporate law, and it was pretty quick that we realized that you can't just rewrite your charter. That sadly, in many jurisdictions, if you rewrite your charter and you're challenged, corporate law will supersede simply amending your charter, and you would lose a lawsuit if somebody said you did not maximize my return. And so we quickly kind of realized that there needed to be a second piece of the pie around impact governance. It wasn't just going to be a paragraph that you could include in your membership agreement or your articles of incorporation or in your partnership agreement. What it meant was that we had to fundamentally change corporate law. We're going to have to create a new legally recognized corporate form. It's called a benefit corporation. And the other, and I want to importantly pause on this, the idea of a new corporate form in this space is not a new idea. It's existed for about 35, 40 years. The only innovation that B-Lab brought was we inverted the process. And what I mean by that is people have been talking about a new corporate form for a long time. They've gone to legislators and said, listen, we have this whole community of folks who want to be different. They want to have a corporate form that meets their needs. And legislators said, show me. Like, where's the community? Who am I passing this legislation for? And so what we have found is actually to pass the legislation, you got to build the community certified B corporations first. It is that group of leaders that then inspires the legislators to act, right? So the new corporate form was passed for the first time in Maryland, I think about 5.5, 6 years ago. It has since passed in 35 jurisdictions in the United States. Recently, last year, it passed in Italy. And it is moving forward in about a dozen countries right now, including Canada. Okay, and I would anticipate over the course of the next 3 years for there to be a constant drumbeat of countries that adopt this new legally recognized corporate form. And now it was inspired by the G7. People familiar with the Social Impact Task Force that was formed by Dave Cameron, led by Ronnie Cohen. And so Ronnie's been a great friend of ours for a long time, and we sat on that task force, and part of that task force included a portion on governance, and one of the core recommendations from that governance committee was that, in fact, the benefit core structure should exist in every jurisdiction. And so we're hoping that, as I said, over the next 3 years, we'll see, let's call it 5 to 7 of those 12 actually adopt the legislation. I will tell you, we got to be really careful when we do this in countries, because it's unlike in most places, Canada and the United States, that you get one bite at the apple. In most jurisdictions, corporate law is federally organized versus provincially or statewide. And so we screwed it up lots of times in the United States, as we learned over 35 different states. When we go into countries, we don't want to screw it up because we'll get one good bite. We'll get one good bite. So I think that'll pass over the next 12 years. There are currently about 6,000 benefit corporations, okay? And it's growing much more rapidly than the certification. So the benefit core structure now has existed for, call it 5 years, 5.5 years, and it already has almost 3x the community of certified B corporations, and that's by design. You want to become a benefit core, you don't have anything to do with Marie Amelia and I. You go directly to your Secretary of State and you register your company as a benefit core. All right? It is that easy. We have relationships with Clerky and I think LegalZoom and others who allow you actually to be a benefit corp right online, the same way you've incorporated as a traditional corporation. Okay. Importantly, that's not all of our policy work. People familiar with ERISA? Anybody familiar with that legislation in the United States? Okay. So it is, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's important because I think it's one of the most important things our movement has done. So ERISA governs the way that pension capital is invested in the United States. Pension capital represents trillions of dollars. It is probably the largest concentration of a single segment of wealth in the United States. And ERISA, back at the end of the Bush administration, the Bush administration put out new guidance on ERISA that essentially reaffirmed shareholder primacy. And I think by accident, quite honestly, it created a chilling effect on pension capital being invested in sustainable businesses. And so underneath the Obama administration, we worked with Secretary Perez, the Department of Labor Secretary, to actually rewrite that guidance, to create an opportunity for pension managers to move money into sustainable businesses and consider environmental, social, and governance factors when they're deploying their capital. The reason why that matters is it should unlock, quite honestly, billions of dollars to be moved from pension funds into sustainable businesses. So we do many things on the policy front. We're mostly known for the work around benefit corp, but I at least wanted to highlight what we've done on the ERISA side because I think it's relevant to some of the other work we do. And importantly, I do want to pause though before we leave this slide, and that I'm sure most of you are familiar with the complete train wreck that is American politics right now. This legislation has passed 24 times unanimously without a single vote in opposition. That's damn near a miracle in the United States right now. To have, when Nikki Haley was governor of South Carolina, loved the legislation, big old PR event around the passage of the legislation, and Governor Cuomo in New York, similarly, super excited about the legislation. I use those two, that's about, if I went much farther left or right, you'd fall off the table. Right? So those two are decent indicators that this is legislation that everybody can get behind. The idea of using business as a force for good is a policy idea that is easy to be adopted by both the left and the right. And I don't need to go into why, we can talk about that later. I think you guys can guess as to why this would work for both the left and the right. So what's next on governance? Well, the truth is the adoption rate on the benefit core structure is impeded mostly by investors. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in our challenges, but fundamentally we need to get investors on board. We don't need them to be flag bearers. They don't need to be out in front of the parade. We need them to at least be neutral on the corporate form. So that when you, as a business leader or an entrepreneur, look to raise capital and you want to be doing it as a benefit corporation, you don't run into an impediment from investors. And so we have spent probably the last 3 or 4 years focusing first on venture capital and moving to institutional investors on trying to socialize the idea that benefit corp should not be a reason why you don't make an investment. We don't need it for them to be a reason why they want to make an investment. At a minimum, they need to be neutral. And this is the next frontier for us on impact governance. If we're going to drive that 6,000 to 60,000 to 600,000, people need to feel like it is not going to get in the way of them accessing the capital markets. Second scaling vehicle, the impact assessment. It's public good. It's free and available for anybody to use. Embedded are case studies, best practice guides, links and resources, improve your score tools, all for free in the impact assessment. Currently, we have about 65,000 users of the impact assessment. I'd say I think the number is 26,000 or so completers. That's a couple months old, so my guess is it's probably 28, 29,000. We add between 15,000 and 20,000 new users a year currently. Okay. It is a free roadmap. It's a guideline. It's a do-it-yourself consulting tool to allow a company to improve their social and environmental performance and benchmark themselves very simply with tools at the back end. You can see how you're doing against other certified B corporations, against what we call traditional businesses or ordinary businesses, and other sustainable businesses. So we break our benchmarks into 3 broad categories and provide for free an opportunity for a company to see how they're doing. And that's how it's being used, mostly. Remember, 65,000 different users, 2,200 certified B corporations. Now, the reason why I want to emphasize that is because that ratio, that 30-to-1 ratio, we care about. Like, what we are trying to drive is an expansion of that ratio. For every new certified B Corp, we'd like to see as many as 100 users of the impact assessment. If I go back 5 years ago, it was about 10-to-1. 600 B Corps, 6,000 users of the impact assessment. Today, 2,200, 65,000, 30-to-1 or so leverage ratio, trying to drive that to 100-to-1. Now, importantly, we are a very small NGO. 72 people here in the United States and North America, including Canada, another 80 with our global partners. Call it 150 individuals working on this movement. How are we going to take this to 100-to-1 ratio? It's going to be through partnerships. All right? The tool itself, all the data, as you guys know, drops into a common database we call B Analytics. And that tool has power for intermediaries. We have 4 verticals that we work through: supply chain, investors, business associations, and government. And we create the opportunity for those intermediaries, those partners, to ask a cohort of companies to use the impact assessment. And then it allows those partners to benchmark the results. They can take a look at how their own cohort is doing against everybody else in the database, and they can cut and dice that data by actual indicator, by question, and then by industry, geography, location. All right? These are just some examples of our partners. I think we have about 160 different partners right now that are driving usage of the impact assessment. Excuse me. The tools that are core to that strategy, the impact assessment, our analytics tool, and then we have something called B Impact Management, and it just gives you an idea of where everybody is in the process. So if you're an investor and you're asking a cohort of companies, your portfolio, to use the tool, you can quickly reference in this particular tool, company X is 75% through, company Y hasn't actually logged on in 2 months, and company Z is 100% complete. Just gives you a quick way to understand where your cohort of companies are. This trio forms the core of our impact management strategy. So that's our ecosystem: certified B corporations, impact governance tools, impact management tools. Where are we today? You got a sense of where we've come from for the last 10 years. Let's talk about highlights of the year. First, global expansion. And so up until the end of 2016, we were really only in Latin America, Australia, Europe, and North America. Okay? And in 2017, we've moved both onto the African continent and the Asian continent. In Africa, we opened B Lab East Africa in Nairobi. We also opened an office down in Johannesburg, B Lab South Africa. In Asia, we have opened up B Lab Japan, B Lab Korea, B Lab Taiwan, B Lab Singapore, and B Lab Hong Kong. Those are the markets that right now we're trying to penetrate in 2017 and 2018. And we'll talk a little bit about what's coming next in just a second. But that global expansion has been a massive lift for our 150 team members, right? Trying to enter into all those markets and learning those markets has been both inspiring and incredibly challenging. And obviously in each of those markets, we found the local partner on the ground to represent the local B Lab, to bring that ecosystem approach and the regional expertise. Laureate education. Where's my friends from Laureate? Hey, Denise. I didn't even see you underneath the hat. Good to see you.
You don't want to.
You should be giving this presentation. You've seen it now. So we had our first initial public offering of a certified B Corp and a benefit corp. There are other publicly traded certified B Corps and benefit corps, but this is the first time we actually had an IPO. And I do think we will look back on it as one of the core hurdles that needed to be scaled before we could see this movement accelerate, to actually have Laureate leading the way and demonstrating that becoming a benefit corp and going public are not mutually exclusive, that you can get the commitment and following of institutional investors. The fact that they continue to perform well is equally good for the movement, and now we need to inspire others to follow their lead. I would say in the last 2.5 years, maybe even 2 years, there's been accelerating interest from multinationals in this movement. I can almost put my finger on the moment that the interest level changed. In a single week, 3 things happened. People familiar with Etsy? Okay. Etsy went public as a certified B Corp. They weren't a benefit corp, but they were a certified B Corp. And the story of their IPO was that they were the first certified B Corp of scale to go public. Simultaneously, people familiar with Natura Cosmetics down in Brazil. Natura, who had already certified, took the vote with their investors to rewrite their articles to include our legal framework. It was 100% vote. Complete unanimity across their investor base to support the change of their articles of incorporation in Brazil. And then third, based upon those 2 things, Guilherme from Natura, at the end of the week, it was actually within 7-day period, was at Davos and talked to his dear friend, Paul Pullman. And so Paul took the stage at Davos and said, on the stage at Davos, the North Star for Unilever is to be a certified B Corporation. The week thereafter was CGI. President Clinton, who's been a great advocate of this movement, interviewing Paul Pullman on the stage at CGI. Presses Paul. Hey, listen, I heard this at Davos. Did you really mean that? Paul doubled down. Said, yes. They're not ready for us yet, but when they are, Unilever should be a certified B Corporation. That 2-week period changed the interest level for multinationals. Obviously, there had been a ton of work that had happened beforehand that created set the table for that type of interest. But since that day, the mounting interest from large companies is a constant drumbeat. We get calls every week. And it's not just here in North America, it is global. So that is a significant development to the movement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because it honestly is a double-edged sword, and I'll talk more about that as well. Other highlight. So we launched in 2016 at our Champions Retreat our Inclusion Challenge, and the reason why it's relevant, and I view it as a highlight for 2017, it was the first time in 9 years that we asked something of the community of certified B corporations. We asked the entire community to commit to making 3 changes in their organization around creating a more inclusive economy. We had never before asked something of the community. We don't require people to use the intellectual property. We don't require people to put the B on their website. We don't ask much of the community. Instead, we serve the community. We engage the community. But for the first time, we said, what is happening globally requires us to lead. And the way that we're going to lead is to demonstrate that we can come together to move collectively forward towards a more inclusive economy. We created an inclusive economy metric set. We encouraged companies to go online and choose 3 metrics that they would try to improve over the course of the year. And then we had webinars and peer circles and resources available for those companies to try to move towards this objective of a more inclusive economy.